Welcome back, Bromley Baptist Church, to our study in the Old Testament book of 1 Samuel, chapter 16. We have been going through the early part of the life of David. And our first couple of weeks, we looked at the idea that God had chosen David to be the new king. God chose him not based on any outward things, but only on his heart. And now we've been looking at, okay, now that he's chosen him as a king, how does he build him? How does he get him ready? How does he get him prepared to be the king that God has called him to be? And so far we've looked at a couple of ideas. Number one, in verse 19 of 1 Samuel 16, that God uses solitude. David was just out alone in the fields doing his thing, and he learned about God. He learned who God was. He learned to commune with God, to worship, and to spend time just daily alone with the Lord. And then last week we looked at the idea of secrecy. Nobody else knew. Nobody else could tell what God was doing with David. David maybe didn't even know. It was still a secret to him, but all he was doing is, in the meantime, he was just being responsible, doing the things he was called to do every day. Well, today I want us to look at the third idea, and that's the idea of similarity. Similarity. I want to read you these three verses, verse 11 and verse 19, and then jump down to chapter 17, verse 15. It says in verse 11, Samuel said to Jesse, "Are these all the children?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, and behold, he is tending the sheep." Then Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." And then verse 19, it says, So Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the flock." If we go to that next chapter, which is the story of David and Goliath, chapter 17, verse 15, David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's flock at Bethlehem. Three different verses spanned out with several verses in between each one, and David is always doing the same thing. What is he doing? He's keeping his father's sheep. He's tending to his primary responsibility of being a shepherd, day in, day out. It was in that monotonous routine of life, I believe, that David really learned to be a man of God. Nobody writes books about faithfulness. Nobody writes great songs or stories or big awards for people who just show up every single day and do what they're called to do. Yet, if you look at God's word over and over again, that is all that God calls us to be. He doesn't want us to be successful per se. He just wants us to be faithful. He just calls us day after day after day to do what he's called us to do. Remember what we're looking forward, hopefully, to hearing one day. Well done, good and faithful servant. If you look at all the people that accomplished much in the Bible, the Abrahams, the Noahs, the Davids, the disciples, the Apostle Paul, what's the common thread? What was the same about all of them? Faithfulness. They just did what God called them to do. And then they did it over and over and over and over again. By faith, Hebrews 11 tells us. By faith. By faith. That's how they pleased God. That's how they did what they were called to do. By faith, by faith, by faith. Meaning they just day in and day out believed God and then did what God said. What we fail to see is that God is working not just in the big events of our life, but in the daily routine moments and events of our life. I want to get to that point where I see God moving in the regular Tuesday afternoons and not just in the Sunday morning worship time. That I want to be faithful in all of those opportunities, in the Thursday nights and the Saturday mornings. And the Sunday mornings are great, but there's going to be other times as well where God is just as faithful, and I also need to be just as faithful. So I think that's a big deal that we kind of gloss over in the first part of this story about all the things that David does later. They're great, they're wonderful, they're awesome. They're being built here. They're being built in these daily, slow, melancholy, monotonous, boring moments of David's life. That's when he's becoming the faithful king that we will know him to be later in the story. Having said that, God uses the tool of struggle, of struggle. This is several verses, and I'm not going to do the David and Goliath story now. We're going to do it by itself later, but you can see those verses are highlighted here from verse 34 and following of 1 Samuel chapter 17, and that is the story of David and Goliath. So again, I'm not going to go through that story, but I do want to highlight some of the things that are leading into this story. Okay, so let's zoom in on these a little bit. If we go back and look at all the things that David did, he has encounters with lions and bears. Of course, we know that he fights Goliath. He stands up to the 10-foot monster that is Goliath. He gets ignored by his own people, by his own family. When it's time to pick a king, his dad doesn't even call him in, doesn't even have him come be one of the people that they come march before Samuel. We see him criticized. We see him underestimated. Later in his life, Saul is going to hate him and pursue him, try to kill him on multiple occasions. See, being a person of God, a person of character, is not going to be an easy life. If you're going to be a leader, a person that God uses, it's going to be difficult. And I just need to tell you that. I just need to prepare you for that. Yes, there's going to be monotonous, boring times, and then there's also going to be some very difficult times. Listen to what verse 18 says of 1 Samuel 16. Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is a skillful musician, a mighty man of valor, a warrior, one prudent in speech, and a handsome man, and the Lord is with him. If you're going to go through all these struggles, you need to be these things that David was here in verse 18. Number one, he was skilled. He was a faithful, trustworthy artist. Verse 18, I've seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is a skillful musician. He knows his craft. He likes doing what he's been called to do. He has a talent and he uses it. Every person that God's ever created has talent. You need to find what that talent is, and then use it to glorify the Lord. And that can be literally in any talent. As long as it's bringing honor to Christ, it's a godly thing. The word there literally means wise, capable, or resourceful in every bit of his conduct. He would need that as a shepherd. He would also need that as a king. And so that was where this starts. He had skill. Number two, he was strong. He was a mighty man, valiant, man of courage. Verse 18 tells us that he was a man of valor, a warrior. You got to be, if you're going to fight off the bears and the lions and the other animals from the sheep, you got to be valiant if you're going to stand up and say, I'm going to be the new king when Saul's already on the throne. You have to be a mighty man to stand up to Goliath. 9 feet, 9 inches tall. And you look at him and you say, man, he's too big to miss. He was a shrewd man. It says he was prudent in matters. I mean, he was careful in his speech. He knew when to talk. He knew when not to talk. That's a lesson probably I need to learn. Proverbs 15:2 says, the tongue of the wise uses knowledge aright, but the mouth of fools pours foolishness. Many times I'm way too quick to talk, and foolishness kind of pours out of my mouth when maybe I would be better served just to be quiet and to listen. He was shrewd. He knew when to speak and when not to speak. And when he did talk, he had something to say. Of all the things I could ever tell you about my dad didn't talk a whole lot. He was a very quiet man most of the time. Of course, he would talk a lot around family, but most of the time in business meetings at church, he was a deacon. He was a leader in church. He was a Gideon. And most of the time he would be quiet. He would listen. And he would listen to everybody. And he would try to gather as much information as he could. And then when he would talk, he would always have something to say. He didn't waste any words. He always said something of value. And I remember that about him. I wish I had more of that characteristic. David was a striking man. The Bible calls him comely, or of good appearance, ruddy and handsome. One translation says a handsome man's what the New American Standard calls him. He was a striking man. He got your attention when he walked in a room. Now that is certainly not a quality of a leader. You don't have to be like that to be a leader, but God had made him beautiful, and all God's creatures are beautiful in their own way. But here's what I really want to get to. The last part of verse 18, the Lord is with him. Because see, none of that other stuff matters much if this one's not true. let's say you're skillful and you're wise and you're handsome and you're good at your job, and on and on and on we could go, but you're trying to do it in your own strength. Well, then it doesn't really matter, does it? Or let's kind of reverse it and say, maybe you don't have a lot of those skills, but you do have the Lord and you're trying to lean on him and you're trying to learn from God and get him to be your leader. Well, then it helps in a very good way. See, the most important thing a leader can be is to be following God. Rusty Ricketson, Dr. Rusty Ricketson, was one of my most influential professors through my master's and doctoral studies. And he wrote a book called Follower First. And his entire life is based on the idea that until you are a good follower of Jesus, you don't need to worry about being a leader. You need to be a good follower. And if you're a really good follower of Jesus, you'll look up and other people will be coming up behind you. You'll be leading them. And you'll be leading them because you're a good follower yourself. Follower first. David was a follower first. The Lord was with him. And since the Lord was with him, other people took note of that. And they followed him as well. There were going to be struggles. And during those struggles, David was going to have to be a leader. As the king, the nation was going to look to him during those struggles to decide what to do. And they're going to begin doing that next Sunday night. They're going to begin doing that when we look at the story of David and Goliath. I know that's one you're looking forward to. So we will get to it very soon. And I look forward to studying that together with you. In fact, we may save that one for our first Sunday night together. Guys, I'm excited. November the 7th. Fall back. We get an extra hour that day. What are we going to do with that hour? We're going to go to church. We're going to get back to Sunday night church together, 6 p.m. on Sunday night. And we're going to look at this story of David and Goliath together on that Sunday night. Make plans to be there for that. And until then, or until I see you again, Brumley, go serve your King.